Okay, it's a good time. Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the latest presentation of the Rift Valley webinar series. My name is Federico Falletti. I am the host for today's talk. If you're participating in the live webinar, you can submit your questions or comments in the chat at any time during the presentation, or if you want to ask a voice question, you can raise your hand at the end in the Q&A. Today's speaker is our own Andrew Harvey. Andrew is a junior professor at the University of Bayreuth, and he's also the co-founder of the Rift Valley Network that hosts him today. His work focuses on language documentation and description in the Tanzanian Rift. And in today's talk, he will talk about the existing documentary record of the region's languages and compare that to the current standards for reproducibility and open data. Please let's welcome Andrew Harvey.
Hello, and thank you, Federico, for that introduction. So I must admit that putting together this talk, the first one after the webinar series returns from its sabbatical, has had me revisiting the webinars of years past, looking for general themes that I might address, and perhaps somewhat predictably, I return to our first ever talk given by Richard Griscom and I to get back in touch with the spirit of those early days of the Rift Valley Network and to speak a bit to the central impulse behind the creation of the network in the first place. We labeled that talk a prolegomenon for research and a network, and among other things, it identified a core area of interest, gave a bare bones review of what we knew about the area at the time, and near the end, laid out some of the desired key activities of the group in the immediate and into the midterm future. Now, this talk will not be as ambitious. Perhaps the 7 years that have intervened between then and now have made me a bit more realistic. So today I would like instead to build on the call in that prolegomenon for the development of shared resources for the network and focus on what seems to me an important shared resource both for the Rift Valley Network and for the Rift Valley more broadly, that being language documentation and language data in general. For this, I'll move to another webinar given in the early days of the Rift Valley Network, that being Harold Hammarström's 2022 talk entitled The State of Description of the World's Languages with a Focus on Africa and the Rift Valley. So according to this talk, the Tanzanian Rift is notable in that its languages enjoy rates of description approaching those of the languages of Europe and North America. That is, many of the languages spoken in the Rift have extensive grammar books, dictionaries, and the like. However, amid calls for linguistic analyses to be reproducible, the proposal that, quote, the data on which publications are based and made available so that other scientists could ostensibly verify the results for themselves, unquote, that's from Gawne and Berez-Kroeker 2018. This sort of proposal is worth taking seriously, and I would think the gold standard for such data would be large, durable, open access collections of diverse naturalistic speech genres, the kind of output described by Himmelmann 2006 as a language documentation. So this talk therefore makes a documentary review of sorts of the Tanzanian Rift, evaluating the materials that already exist, as well as identifying areas for future documentation. I'll do this by making a rough list of language communities which seem to me to be a good starting point for developing the bases of a language documentation. I will then review this list to try and identify the extant audiovisual material collections, and if there are extant collections, I'll then see if I can access them, and then I'll try to illustrate what sorts of data is associated with these materials. So let us start then by listing languages. Now, all of you will know, of course, that such an undertaking is fraught, what with the risk of erasing communities or introducing classifications that are not socially or even linguistically real. I would like, therefore, the resulting list that I produce here to be contested, as well as changed as our understanding grows and changes as well. But let's get on with it. So let's start with this graphic used in Richard and my 2019 talk, listing the languages we take as the core of our research area, as well as the number of speakers and a vitality assessment. So restated here in a tabular format I can play around with, and with a couple of adjustments, including using the Tanzanian Language Atlas for most of the measures for speaker numbers. I would like now to make a proposed adjustment which might prove a little bit more controversial, and that is to modify our concept of Rift Valley languages. The first reason for doing this is because, from a descriptive perspective, we often do not know how much variation these cover language terms hide. So, for example, and as we shall see a little bit later in this presentation, there exists a detailed grammar of the Nyaturu language. However, the author himself notes that this grammar is based primarily on one variety of Nyaturu. We also know that the Nyaturu people were never a politically unified entry, as Marguerite Jellicoe writes in this 1969 article. This seems to me to be a good reason to at least begin treating Nyaturu as a cover term for at least 3 different speech varieties. The second reason for reconsidering our list of Rift Valley languages, and the most relevant in the context of this talk, is because, as noted in Himmelmann 1998, documentary approaches are concerned less with languages and more with the linguistic practices of a speech community. That is, where the aims of a language description may be satisfied by the collection of, say, an extensive word list or, say, in the comprehensive description of a paradigm, a language documentation is concerned with how these things are employed across the speech of a given speech community. So, given the focus is on speech community rather than the language, aiming for a more restrictively defined entity or restrictively defined entities, in this case, should result in documentations which are more representative of the contexts identified. Now, before going on, it's important that I don't give the impression that these 2 subfields are somehow irreconcilable. That is, you can't do one while doing the other. Indeed, they both contribute and feed back into each other in crucial ways, but I digress. So how then did I go about modifying our list here? So the first was simply identifying if these languages are described as containing variation significant enough for distinct varieties to be mentioned, and therefore distinct communities to be postulated by me. So as such, mention of Highland Rangi versus Lowland Rangi in Gibson 2012 was sufficient for me to suggest a split for documentary purposes. Masale's 2001 dissertation was also important here. Here, the focus is on identifying varieties or dialects, specifically defined by phonetic distinctions within larger groups. However, if we accept that speaking differently is also associated with being a member of a different community, be that a community of practice or a political community or a social community, we should at least entertain the reality of a rather more extensive list of speaker communities to base a documentation around. Additionally, I added one variety of Sukuma, which is, or at least is possibly, an important contact language to the west of our area as traditionally construed. This is identified as Jinakea Sukuma by Masale 2001 and is circled here in red. Finally, I included the languages Hadza, Asach, and Omayo as well. After all of this yields an expanded list which looks like this. And before going into each of the rows in detail, I'd like to first establish some caveats. So first, and especially given the venue here today, it's important that I underscore the fact that the Tanzanian Rift Valley as a linguistic area is only a useful concept insofar as it helps us think about language contact over time and space. And as such, it is really the individual instances of language contact that matter rather than the inclusion of one language or another on a list. So for example, my work with Hannah Gibson and Richard Griscom, looking at preverbal clitic complexes in the languages of the Rift, essentially exclude Rangi, Mbugwe, and Sandawe from the list in that the grammatical phenomena they exhibit we characterize as being fundamentally different from that observed in the other languages of our Rift sample, at least for that particular feature. Conversely, work by Zahran and Dom in 2024 on reflexive reciprocal syncretism in Bantu languages show that contact phenomena originating in the Rift may include languages from much further afield. Furthermore, I'd like to explicitly mention that Ma probably should be included here on this list. Additionally, and though I argue that this procedure of widespread splitting will probably lead to more representative or at least better targeted documentation efforts, I cannot make any strong claim that any given varietal subdivision given here will lead to more representative or better targeted documentation. Many such divisions here are based on observations in existing literature and determinations as to whether these divisions are the only ones which can be made or that they are the most valid divisions a given community would make. These assumptions have to be considered tentative. With that said, I think we can proceed with a review of the extant materials. So, Alagwa, for which we have a grammar in the form of Mouse 2016, is known to have a set of written notes and audio recordings stored in the field recordings of Roland Kiesling and Martin Mouse. Burunge, which also features a grammar, Kiesling 1994, has around 8 hours of audio recordings as well as written notes, also in Roland Kiesling's field recordings. A sketch of Gorwa exists in Harvey 2018, and Harvey 2017 is an archival deposit of approximately 550 hours of audiovisual recordings. And here we can see an example from the archive rendered into a subtitled video with a Gorwa transcription and an English translation. This is Ako Berez-Kroeker telling Ako Bu Sakware and Pascal Bu about the prophet Sagilo Magena. So let's see if my computer will load this. I see I'm getting a spinning ball here, but let's wait a second. It's just all too much.
I think there's an optimized for video setting, so you may want to reshare with that checked. That may require you to share your audio.
Sure, let me give this a shot, Martha. Let's see what we got here. Let's see what we got. Share. I can finally see everybody now. Hello. Optimize for video sharing, portion of screen. Share. Here we are. Oh, it's still giving me a, I think that might be actually just on my side here. Let's just jump into this PowerPoint. There's a fair bit of media in this presentation, but this is the first time that this has happened. Let me just very quickly do a little force quit, and then we're going to open it up again, see what happens. Okay. And then we're going to open it up again and see where we are. Let's get right to here. This is, of course, the magic of television. We can, in the recording later on, we can cut all this out. Makes more work for you, though. Let's see what we got here. This is portion of screen. I'm sharing sound. I'm optimizing for video sharing. Sharing again. Let's go. All right. So let's try that again. So as I've said, here we can see an example from the archive rendered into a subtitled video with a Gorwa transcription and an English translation. This is Ako Berez-Kroeker telling Ako Bu Sakware and Pascal Bu about the prophet Sagilo Magena.
Segelo ya, segelo nagu wa khatsawa ama imburu. Ena amsi nagu segelo 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 wa khat Akamisang.
Khamis.
Alo, segelo agua khatsewa ama imburu. Segelo matatelo lo awate garsinga ar amsio. Segelo matatelo awate. Segelo na u hayada. Na o aya iro. Momo kusege kwateri temero fagsari gira.
Dosi kwateri temero na ati kay.
Fagsari gira hayada ngina u. Kalau mua fakis gira os. Na o kunyahas. Ina ibu ku. Kahado hunta ka isi. Kung kami inte konda. Gazaan amsio.
So the copious output surrounding Iraq, so moving on to Iraq, it kind of represents one of the study areas that's most lively among the languages of the Rift, and Mouse 1993 represents the most extensive description of the language. So Martin Mouse has estimated that his field recordings now total over 200 hours. And some of Mouse's field recordings have been shared across several websites, including the Dutch Stemmen van Afrika, as well as this one, which is available on YouTube.
Ang amar ka ider barayam. Amar ka wak. Amazing ang narkoto. Gari ikoni ka, ikwal ikonda ka. Dos la tema ga la sera ka, balay ka dasi. Amazing firari. Kri firari daqar ka ide. Yisdi in la dasi. Kara ama bira puro firur e. Kan bay ayo hakar ni wat. Aku sudah sekian behani do ewat angki ain sir elisa. Irtam milina milaha. Kara mari kat Hamare en awal sina sama garni kom iwaka. Lo aren hum doni ida. Barado he porule.
So as can be seen, the YouTube material is really quite nice with these beautiful videos along with subtitles in Iraq orthography. One commenter, and I do not know whether he is an Iraq person or not, but he certainly seems to have an Iraq-sounding username, simply says thank you. So you can see how people appreciate this kind of high-quality material. So moving from Iraq to Quadza, Eretz 1974 Quadza, spelled with a KW apostrophe in that work, is the most extensive description I know of this language. I know of no extant audio or video recordings of speakers of this language, which is now no longer spoken. Asach is similar. I'm not aware of any audiovisual materials associated with this language, now almost certainly no longer spoken. A sketch of Ihanzu, which is represented by Beletsky and Diami, 2019, is the most extensive description of this language. Harvey 2019b is an archival deposit of around 280 hours of audiovisual recordings. Here's an example of a short video from the language archive whose subtitling was generated from the material deposited alongside the audio and video. So here, local researcher Samuele Isia is speaking with John Kipimo about riddles as a genre.
Kendele kwa adaki humila lero kutakile kilalike ekali ema humo no wilaliki aimenda palungwi sasa ntakile lero kilalike neke wilaliki aida okite uzaki
antawaiti Owilaleki ni mahumo yantaiti aidha kole ndogo eye ingwi.
So I'd let them go on, but we have to keep to a schedule. So moving from Ihanzu to Mbugwe. So Mbugwe's most extensive description is Mouse 2004. I'm not aware of any extant audiovisual recordings of the language, though I expect they do exist. And so with regards to Nyaturu, despite there being a grammar of Nyaturu, the Munyingani variety was not the variety described in this work, and I'm unaware of any audiovisual recordings in this particular variety. The Ahi variety of Nyaturu is also undescribed, but with that said, Howard Olson made a recording featuring a 9-minute naturalistic conversation between two Ahi speakers. So if I play this from around the middle, let's see if I can do that. It's around here, I think, that they start in the Ahi. So here we have Ahi speakers Jumanne Hema and Athmani Majilanga having a conversation. We unfortunately have no transcription or translation of what is being said, but this is certainly better than nothing. So let's see if we can get them speaking here.
Between two men of the Hanja area whose names are Jumanne Hema and Asmani Majilanga. In this case, Asmani will visit the home of Jumanne. Let's listen in to what they say.
I know Baba, the beautiful. Hurry, nothing gave him the one in the Horag, a more chance. They got the song there. Sayuna, Papa and Gary. Oh, really? What you are one young one already? I got one young one when you are then down Puma. Oh, really? I told you, I think where you were in Twin Oya from you were you have. That's I. You go out, but you could get my coffee, you live, and that too.
So the final of the three Nyaturu varieties that I identified in the literature, Rwana is the variety described in Olson's 1964 Nyaturu grammar. So in the same recording as described for Ahi above, there's a naturalistic conversation between two Rwana speakers of approximately 8 minutes.
Đó đây bà theo nó thì phải nói bể từ phía đây phải hay là cái hành động càng cao đấy càng có lúc xưa nằm ở cái 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 thay vào càng kia bà thấy cái lulu đấy có đây cả mà bà thấy mà liu đấy cả that's đến chuyện chơi đây cái này đều tạo đấy chúa cái thằng mấy ở đây cả từ phía phía mà đúng nhà cái
So here we have Rana speakers Mikaeli Luther and Zacharias Sima having a conversation. Again, we unfortunately have no transcription or translation of what is being said. So from...
Today we're going to make a few recordings of...
Okay, there we go. So moving from Nyaturu to Nyilamba, specifically the variety Nyilamba Central, Johnson's 1923 sketch of Nyilamba grammar, and we should probably call it a sketch, doesn't indicate which variety it is based on, though this could probably be determined by comparing the lexical forms used therein to those recorded in Masele's 2001 dissertation. I'm not aware of any recordings which exist for this variety. The same observation applies to the Ushola variety of Nyilamba, as well as to the Iambi variety and the Mbuga variety. Gibson 2012 relied most heavily on data collected with speakers in Haubi, where Highland Rangi is described as being spoken. And again, I'm not aware of any extant audiovisual material. And the same applies for Lowland Rangi. Kagwema, sort of moving to Kimbu, Kagwema 2022 is an archive collection of 20 hours of audiovisual material. I was unable to determine whether this collection contains either North or South Kimbu. Either way, with the data archived, it was possible for me to go into the deposit and to extract the material from any given recording and to produce a short subtitled video with both a Kimbu transcription, rough Kimbu transcription, as well as a Swahili translation. So this is a video of Ida Sanane being interviewed by the documentarian Agostino Amos Kagwema about Kimbu culture.
Basi mbevauka vakuya kunyumba yonyine vayile kubanya basi mbevaya ipo vakuya kwikhala vakukaribishiwa pa nyuma ya nyumba vakwikhala basi wanakuitanwa kwita nuyonye na khubanya khubanywa basi bana bakwikhala iho akhusonsomola noyo asimbe basonsomola noyo asimbe bigombya asibona khutuba khukhaye batuba khukhayo yonye baba khotuma omuntu mwene khuya sasa khuya khuba wila ipo khugana apatago mukima.
So moving from Kimbu to Sukuma, specifically Jinyakea Sukuma. Jinyakea Sukuma features no description nor any recordings of which I am aware. Moving now to Datoga, the Datoga varieties, Griscom 2019 is an archival collection containing around 140 hours of audiovisual recordings of Asamjeg Datoga. So from this material, again, it's relatively easy to extract the data needed to create the subtitled video you'll see here in a second, with both an Asamjeg transcription and an English translation. So this is a discussion between Barandi Girgwaged and Udagunoga Kamar about their childhood.
Kawej bunged mudmalik chan miyiti bungedi tagadan dia gesar man daida yit gesar man yudmiye kesen andu mandu andumul badaw quando shandal quando dum seguro senga mayo gesar man sen Yesar manya habung edam dulan yebiko.
So let's see if I can move to the next slide here. Yes, here we go. Mitchell 2017, so from Azamjeg to Barbaiga, Mitchell 2017 is a small collection featuring some speakers of Barbaiga Datoga carrying out a prompted discourse task. I'm unsure of how many minutes of Barbaiga are included here because it's a mix of Barbaiga and Gisamjanga. I couldn't tell from the metadata immediately available to me which variety was which in the archive. From Barbaiga to Bianjida has no dedicated description, and as far as I know, no extant recordings. Mitchell 2017 also contains recordings of Gisamjanga speakers conducting a prompted discourse task, though I'm again unsure of how many minutes this represents. Roland Kiesling's field recordings of Gisamjanga total over 550 hours. Though in a rather tenuous situation, with probably only 3 elderly speakers remaining, the small archived collection Griscom 2020b contains 2.5 hours of Omayo speakers producing words. So here we can hear Richard Griscom eliciting the first person singular pronoun, starting in Swahili, then working through a translator into Ma, and then from Ma to Omayo with the speaker Nairuko Siruwananga. So let's see if we can get this to play.
Yeah. Mayagi.
So this is a recording of Omayo. Sander Steeman writes that he made audio recordings during his doctoral research with Sandawe, which I believe to be the Western variety, though I'm unsure how much material exists. And as far as I understand, no recordings exist for Eastern Sandawe. SANS 2013 A to D represent a series of sections spread throughout 4 chapters treating the grammar of languages of the non-genetic Khoisan grouping. And Griscom and Harvey 2020 is an archival deposit of Hadza with roughly 230 hours of audiovisual material representing the variety of Hadza spoken to the southeast of Lake Eyasi. Here's an example of a subtitled video with transcription in Hadza and translation into English produced from the data available in the archive. So here, Ate Pandisha talks to local Hadza researcher Bunga Paolo about taboos associated with hunting. Additionally, Griscom and Harvey 2020 now also features approximately 80 hours of Hadza as spoken in and around Sungu and the communities to the northwest of Lake Eyasi. So, and here is part of a conversation between local researcher Paulina Nyerere on the right and Holo Magembe on the left. Again, this subtitled video was generated from the data available in the archive. So this marks the end of the review, a tour around that we've been focusing on. And now we might be able to try and say something about it. So returning now to our table, we can perhaps establish a distinction. That is, the languages for which we have some recordings, here in green, and those for which we do not, here in red. Though when I look at this, it doesn't feel like a particularly useful distinction, as we know that not all recordings are equal. Let's demonstrate this point by comparing two documentations, Olsen 1961 and Kagwema 2022. So Kagwema 2022 is the result of a project funded by the Endangered Languages Documentation Program and sort of took place first and foremost within a documentation framework. It's relatively large, 20 hours, and it contains both audio and video recordings. Many recordings are naturalistic, so some are interactive between two or more speakers, and some are procedural explanations of how to carry out everyday tasks. Over 30 speakers are featured in the recordings, and several genres, including songs, are included. In many ways, this kind of work represents a best practice to be emulated across our work. Olsen 1961, on the other hand, is much more limited in scope, an old audio recording of less than half an hour featuring 6 speakers. Now, the existence of such a record is invaluable, but is not really what would be considered a language documentation, and above all is probably not a strong footing to begin any sort of database description of the Nyaturu varieties included here. And so what then is to be made of the recordings which exist primarily as field recordings? After all, some of these resources are very large indeed and also feature a diverse set of speakers and speech genres. Crucially, however, these kind of resources are highly limited in their usability. An important intervention here comes in Gawne and Berez 2012, who remind us that, quote, archiving is an essential part of any language documentation work, in which a major motivation is to create an enduring record of the language. Unfortunately, your computer is not an archive. An external hard drive, as crucial as it is for day-to-day backup, is not an archive, nor is a website from which you make multimedia files available for download. So really, they're trying to underscore the fact that when we archive, we really need to be archiving with specific sites and organizations that are set up to record the material in a long-term manner. Now, an understandable response to this kind of reminder is to ask how it is one can be expected to archive all of their material when the cost associated with such an undertaking is often seen as prohibitive. After all, most of the fully archived documentations in the list are all results of a dedicated multi-year documentation projects and have been archived at considerable expense. So my mother once asked me how many lexical items I had in my Gorwa draft dictionary, and I told her. She then asked me how many dollars it had cost per word, and I refused to answer that question. So it's clear that this cannot be the only solution to our needs of open data. Instead, I think an exciting alternative exists in something like Griscom 2020b, the Omayo Language Resources Collection. So here, individual recordings have been made openly available in the Open Science Framework for long-term durable storage. Together with detailed data on each recording, this service offers many of the functionalities of a dedicated language archive, but crucially is free to use. The Olson 1961 materials are also stored in such a way using the digital archive Zenodo, which is also free to use. I'll finish this section with more from Berger and Berez. Quote, many people think of archiving as the last step in a research program to be done years after the fieldwork is complete, after everything has been transcribed and mined in service of analysis. Essentially, something to be done after we are, quote, finished with the data. Here, we advocate the exact opposite. Data should be archived immediately and often. Whenever you finish a transcription, archive it. When you write up an analysis, archive it. As your lexical database grows, archive it. If you make a children's book from your data, archive it. End quote. So after this examination, what we are left with is what I would characterize as probably a workable four-way distinction. So we have languages in green, which enjoy archival deposits which are large, diverse, and available for use by others. We have languages in yellow, which, though they do not provide the size and diversity of a language documentation, are still archived and openly available together with rich metadata, giving good context on what is in the recording. Languages in orange, for which data exists, but this data is currently unarchived and not openly accessible. And finally, languages in red, which do not, to my knowledge, have recordings of any kind. With this picture, I would then suggest the following operationalization. So items I have highlighted in green here enjoy existing documentary collections. They may feature best practices for which other documentations in the region could be structured, or how they may be established. Furthermore, the data from these documentary collections should be readily used, and if they're difficult to use, either by other researchers or by members of the speech communities from which they came, they should be modified and improved to be easier to use. Items I have highlighted in yellow here have been made openly accessible, even if they are not full documentation. So this kind of material, again, should be seen as a kind of baseline for what we must do with our data. The data, again, should be used in publications, and because these languages do not have documentations, work with their speaker community should begin to create language documentations if they are comfortable with that kind of work being done in their community. Items in orange have existing materials, but they are not openly accessible. So these materials are in danger of loss or degradation, and plans should be developed to archive these materials and, if at all possible, make them openly accessible. Now, in some cases, these materials can actually form a language documentation, or at least a large part of one. And if the materials are not extensive, then work with their speaker communities should begin to create a language documentation. Items in red have no documentary material, and therefore, again, work should begin with their speaker communities in order to create language documentations. Now, returning to the table then, all rows in colors other than green should be seen as priorities for language documentation. That's a total of 3/4 of the sample examined today. And in fact, even the rows in green should still be seen as appropriate communities with whom to conduct additional documentation. Just because the documentation is done doesn't mean the language is done in any way, shape, or form. I know, for example, both Ihanzu and Asamjeg Datoga communities have members who still practice blacksmithing. This is a classic source for special speech registers and should be investigated from a documentary perspective. Even Kwadza and Asach are still relevant here. So though the languages may be no longer spoken, the communities are most likely still home to traditions, practices, and ways of speaking that reveal insight, both linguistic and cultural, of their past and present communities. With that said, then, I think we can proceed with, I think that we can probably conclude. And to do that, I'm going to go back to where we started, back to where this webinar series started with the prolegomenon. Here on the YouTube page, the video has a single comment, which I'll expand for us to take a look at. Now, clearly the commenter is not a native speaker of English, but I think when I read it out, the message comes through loud and clear. So, do you have video, audio of what you're talking about for such a long time here? That is, the languages. Or are you waiting for all the speakers to die? Videos of native people in native surroundings passing stories to the next generation. Some, as I see some linguists, behave like funeral accountants, and they're closing funeral houses. So, the question really is the Rift Valley Network, as a scholarly organization, interested in the business as usual kind of linguistics, a linguistics fully content to see the language as separate from its speakers and how they use it in daily life? Or is the Rift Valley Network going to commit to the work of being with real people, speaking real languages, with real visions of how their languages fit into not only their pasts, but also their futures and the futures of their children? Knowing what I know, both from the subsequent Rift Valley Network videos that have come out since our prolegomenon, and from living and working with all of you together for the past near decade, I know that the answer is the future. So I expect that there is probably interest in documentation, and I hope that this kind of review starts as at least a basis or a provocation to begin talking about this a little bit more, both in terms of the development of full-scale documentations and in terms of trying to preserve the linguistic resources that we have, the recordings that are currently extant. So I should also say that I do not see the documentary approach as either a silver bullet or as a be-all, end-all for the issue that the commenter is expressing here, but I do see it as a start. So it's my hope that through providing this comment on the state of language documentation in the Tanzanian Rift, that we can start thinking about the integrity of the data upon which we base our work, and we increase our efforts to anchor this data and indeed our work in the communities from which it comes. Thank you, and I'd like to acknowledge the people who appeared either in the videos or in the images or in the recordings. So Behero Kwetso, Bu'u Sakware, Pascal Bu'u, Samueli Isia, John Kipimo, Jumanne Hema, Athumani Majilanga, Mikaeli Luther, Zakaria Sima, Agostino Amos Kagwema, Ida Sanane, Barandi Girgwaged, Udagunoga Kamar Nairuko Siruananga, Bunga Paulo Ate Pandisha Paulina Nyerere, Holo Magembe, and Lagwen Goti. I'd also like to thank the fellow Riftologists who I commented on the extensive field recordings that they possessed. So thank you to Roland Kiesling, Martin Maus, and Sander Steeman. And here are my references and figures.
Wow, thank you so much, Andrew, for an amazing presentation. It's really a pleasure to listen to you talk about something that you have so much passion and love for.
Oh, thank you.
If everyone's ready, we can start with the question and answer section. You can, as I said earlier, you can raise your hand and I will unmute you, or you can write questions in the chat.
Let's see each other now that we've gotten through with that.
Guess I'll raise a hand.
Go for it, Bonnie.
Thanks. Thanks, Andrew. I think this would be great to publish in like Arusha working papers in linguistics or something, really just to highlight that there's a lot of varieties that we don't know that much about, that there's a lot of documentation that needs to be done. I was wondering where you drew the line on the recordings, because I know that you have Tenra's Sandawe recordings, but you didn't mention those, for instance.
I didn't mention those. That was and I'm happy that you're here, Bonnie, because I knew that you were going to help me fill in some of these lacunas. So this was just a sloppy miss on my part.
Okay, because there's also the UCLA recordings, which of course are not documentation, but word list. But I also have, I don't know how, I have a recording of Sandawe from Benji Wald from 1970. I've got recordings from Helen Eaton from 2006.
Oh, you have some of Helen's recordings. Cool.
Yeah, and I know that Tucker and Brian's recordings exist somewhere. I just don't have them. I mean, we need to.
Yes, so exactly. We need to, and what we need to do. So, like, I think about our prolegomenon like 7 years ago, and what came out of that really was the Rift Valley bibliography. In that talk, we were looking at what are the written resources that are available to us. And what came out of that, Bonnie, with your help and with the help of other members of the network at the time, is, we have our document, our bibliography, where people who work on Rift languages can see the things that are written. And I think that has contributed to an improvement in work done on the languages in the area. But also but also, of course, I mean, in addition to the written works that exist, we have recordings. We have sort of the quote unquote raw data that exist, but maybe in a much more tenuous way. So I would hope that just like the prolegomenon was sort of a provocation to get a handle on the literature, I would hope that this talk is a bit of a provocation to help us get a handle on the recordings and the videos that are out there.
Yeah, I've got recordings from Alex de Vogt as well, which unfortunately I don't seem to have a date, but they were before we did our UCLA recordings. Cool. And we worked in Farquhar, which as far as I can tell is kind of more to the eastern side of the Sandawe area, but I was trying to read Saunders' paper to figure that out. And it's finding these things. Like, I have no idea where Saunders' recordings live.
Well, I have some of Tucker and Brian's recordings, but they're songs. I think
even that though, I feel like is useful.
Yeah, absolutely.
Stuff, we go right from.
I found a snippet of Tucker and Brian, what I think is Tucker and Brian's Hadza recordings, in an archive in Cape Town where they were mislabeled, but it's clearly Hadza, but the pronunciation is different. Like for elephant bekauko, the k is very fricated, which it isn't for the speakers of Hadza that I'm familiar with. So any kind of indication of sound change is absolutely fascinating. But let me let Hope ask her question, and I'll shut up now.
Yeah, Hope, please go.
Oh, Bonnie, it's lovely. This is good stuff. I just wanted to thank you, Andrew. That was a lovely look back, also very sort of philosophical, but with data and examples, and very rich, very nice.
Thank you.
And also practical and encouraging. So I had a question about the OSF and Zenodo. Two questions. First of all, are those truly reliable? And second of all, between those, there's a kind of which pros and cons to consider?
So, in terms of Zenodo, which I'm most familiar with, I should say neither of these are language archives. Neither of these are dedicated language archives that have staff who are interested in endangered languages or language material in general, and know everything about that sort of side of things. These are pieces of research infrastructure, more or less, for researchers around the world for maintaining data sets, which is a little bit different. Sure, the stuff that we're aiming at are data sets to an extent, but it's a little bit more than that. I see these things as different from data sets, especially when we start thinking about community reuse. So I'll speak to, this idea of, is Zenodo reliable? And I can really only speak to Zenodo because that's the one that I use the most. Richard was a big fan of OSF. I don't know what he thinks about that these days. I expect it's roughly the same thing. I don't know. But I know that Zenodo is basically the European data repository, and so they are linked. That grew out of CERN, which are the guys that bash the hadrons together or whatever they do. Sorry, I don't mean to sound dismissive. But this originally grew out of CERN because they were generating absolutely massive quantities of data, and they needed a place to store it. So Zenodo grew out of this, and it's becoming more and more adopted, at least among European research institutions. And sort of the guarantee that's based there is they've said that Zenodo will exist as long as CERN exists. So, I mean, I know, for example, that experimental physics, is considered a very sort of core part of science. It's relatively stable in terms of its funding and the long-term projects, I guess. But maybe I'm speaking from an area of ignorance. At least I feel like for any sort of freely accessible and relatively easy to use tool, I'm quite a fan of Zenodo. I know others who maybe feel differently, but I think that Zenodo is probably fine if no other option exists.
Lovely. Thank you.
I have a very different kind of question. So I don't really work in the Rift Valley, as you know, but so I wonder how you sort of conceptualize the Rift Valley as an area. So obviously you have to draw lines somewhere, but how do you sort of think about how to do that?
Okay, so this is a really good question, and it's kind of, I think it's kind of like fundamental to, in a way. So the original sort of Rift Valley languages idea that Richard and I kind of started with was this 2008 article, the Tanzanian Rift Valley area, that was written by Kiesling, Maus, and Nurse in 2008. And they make an argument that this is a linguistic area. And they list a set of features from different modularities of language. So the phonetics, the phonology, the morphology, the syntax, the semantics. And they give arguments as to why these are non-chance and non-inherited similarities between these languages of different genetic stocks. And so that's kind of their argument. Now, these days, if you sit down and chat with any of these authors, they will say to you, actually, is it useful to be drawing borders around a map? And I sort of addressed this a little bit earlier on. I actually don't think it's tremendously useful insofar as the work that we are doing centrally involves trying to tell stories of human contact and how languages change and develop over time. So, like I said, when Richard and Hannah and I went back and said, okay, we're going to look at this feature, the preverbal clitic complex. If we were doing that, then our Tanzanian Rift Valley area would immediately exclude Rangi and Mbugwe because the phenomena are very different by any sort of criteria, and Sandawe too as well, because we've argued that these are probably just Sandawe internal, right? They may have been encouraged through contact, but we had a sense that we don't really see any structural borrowing or any sort of formal borrowing of morphs or anything like that in the Sandawe system. So if we really had to say, well, this is the area, we would then be drawing this really wonky line that would exclude the area in which Rangi is spoken, the area in which Mbugo is spoken, and the area in which Sandawe is spoken. Now, if you take work by Aaron Zahran and Sebastian Dom, for example, that was done in 2024, they looked at this syncretism between reflexive and reciprocal markers, specifically Bantu. But so they're telling a contact story that they posit started in the Rift. They said basically that the non-Bantu languages of Tanzania have this syncretism. And we feel that the Bantu languages that are spoken in our sample, I think they took a sample of maybe 75 languages, they said the ones that exhibit this syncretism seem to have been influenced, and this seems to be a contact story. Not all of them have had direct contact with the non-Bantu languages of the Tanzanian Rift, but this is a feature that has spread out as the languages have diverged and as they've come in contact, as Bantu languages will do. So if we take, this is a Rift story, right? But it's taking us much further beyond the quote-unquote valley, right? So what is the Rift? The Rift is sort of a conceptual center that we return to again and again, but it shouldn't be thought of as a gated area that's keeping concepts or languages in or out, right? So to an extent, it's just a messy working definition that gives us, sort of something concrete to grasp onto in a field where actually it's much more complicated than that. And I would really, really hate it if we start thinking of this as sort of an exclusive way to define the people that we're working with and the language communities and the phenomena that we're looking at. So I hope that we can use this more so as a starting point, but not as a be-all, end-all. Yeah.
But the original concept also was with this Abflusslösungsgebiet. This.
So I'd like to go into the geography
a
little bit more as well. Yeah. I mean, you can draw it on a map, and so if you translate the German, it's this area where the lakes don't, or the rivers don't flow out to the sea, but they flow in. So a lot of the bodies of water in the area in which we work are known as endoheric. So they're endoheric lakes, so water will flow into them, but it won't flow out. I think that this is fascinating. And I don't know if it says anything about the movement of people. I mean, the rivers in and of themselves aren't very big in the area in which we work. It's pretty dry. But I wonder if this says something about the movement of people. If people were moving on canoes, if they were moving on dugouts, and and everything was flowing in and it wasn't flowing out. Well, does that say something about, we've talked about the rift area as an accretion zone. So where different groups come and they sort of layer on top of each other. Well, why are they coming here? Well, is it just that they come and they don't come out? I don't quite understand that, but there is Bonnie is smiling because I could probably say that much more.
Well, I've driven over that rift, and I wouldn't want to have to walk up it either. Sort of like once you're there.
All of this is to say is that, like, our colleague Matthew Knisley mentioned, like, people talk about the rift as a refugium from an archaeological perspective, but he says this is a very strange refugium because there's no physical boundary. So sure, we have these rift escarpments, but that doesn't define the whole area. Yeah. So Gorwa, I mean, you can come in and you can come out easily. If I fall asleep on the bus, it's a pleasant drive in and out. You're not going up anything or over anything that would have been difficult in any sort of distant past to go in. So what Matthew argues is, he says, well, they call it a refugium, but there's no indication that this, geographically at least, was a refuge. Now, you can layer other things on top of that. So what about tsetse fly? Where did forests exist over time? This would have been a barrier to people who were moving with cattle, for example. What about rain patterns? This might have been an impediment to people who were moving with different types of animals. Even different breeds of cattle or ovines, for example, can only survive in certain conditions, right? If a place is too wet, for example, you get things like hoof rot. So would people with domestic animals want to be moving into a place that's really wet? The thing is that very little of this work has been done to sort of figure out, okay, what is the the forest picture? What is the arboreal picture? What is the hydrological picture? What is the and how does that make the area a refuge? Of course, what's difficult here is that these kind of things, even rainfall patterns, move around much more than, for example, a Rift Valley escarpment, right? Or a hill, or even, like a lake. So these things move throughout time and they're transitory. So can we say that the rift was a refuge because of these factors? Maybe, but it would require the same kind of work that was done for the Bantu expansion when they said basically, we had the conditions that occurred in the past for the rainforest to open up and create a corridor and then close back up, right? So this would be the kind of interdisciplinary work that we would really need. And I don't know if there's a basis for that, if there's an empirical basis for us to be doing that. So yeah, these are my thoughts on the rift. I think about this all the time.
Yeah, no, that's really cool and interesting to think about. In a lot of ways where I work is more clearly like a place where you would run up and hide because it's, there's cliffs almost all the way around. So it's interesting that the rift would have been this sort of, so I think the question that you're raising of why people ended up there is an interesting one.
Thank you, Bonnie, for putting that map in the chat.
We need to archive Bonnie's whole computer.
I thought I gave you a lot of these, Andrew, when you came here. You may actually have. I'm just, sending you some of the file names so you can just see.
Perfect.
I was also wondering, for example, for the Toga, you didn't include some of the dialects, and even things on the border with Tanzania, like Omotic, which is another extinct language. I mean, is that part of it, or is it separate? Can we say that it is separate?
You tell me, really. I mean, this is a whole other thing. The reason why I didn't include the other varieties of Datoga, again, I didn't want to be exclusive here. But these were materials that it was a mix of stuff that I knew that we had and that was sort of very, very close to that old classic center, and stuff that, like we didn't have and was sort of further away. And I said, okay, in the interest of time, I'll have to exclude it. But yeah, of course, I mean, the other varieties of Datoga would be just as essential, right?
Okay. So we've reached almost 3:10. If no one has any more questions, then we'll end here. Thank you, Andrew, again for your presentation. And I want to remind everyone that all the recordings will be published on YouTube, and all the bibliographical entries will be in the Rift Valley bibliography. And hope to see you again at the next Rift Valley webinar. I think that's on the 2nd of February, and it will be Cecilia Mignanti's talk on visual semantics in Arusha, Masai.
Thanks, Federico.
Can I make a comment after the recording? Some of those language, like Kimbu, I'm like, sounds Bantu, sounds totally Bantu, but I think it was the Niramba or Ihan, one of them. I'm like, man, that sounds like Datoga.